Early in the 19th century, American Lutherans began to become acclimatized to the dominant Protestant consensus around them. The dominant consensus in the early part of the 19th century was optimistic. It was post-millennial. The world is getting better. We're building the kingdom of God on earth. It was revivalistic. Lutherans used to do revivals. A lot of people don't remember that. It was mission-oriented. It had a strong personal morality. They still wanted to be confessional Lutherans. They didn't want to be Methodists, but in some respects, it was a moderate confessionalism. The confessionalism was that the Lutheran confessions were, that the Bible was the sole authority, that the Lutheran confessions were, insofar as they agreed with the Bible, good statements of good theological statements. Right? But the Lutherans, American Lutherans, didn't always sort of fit in with their Protestant neighbors. They were kind of the younger, oddball, tag-along cousin, but they did seek. I mean, if they did revivalism, they did Lutheran revivalism. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but they did. You know, I mean, they understood themselves as Lutherans in this sense. Well, what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century is that this sort of national Protestant consensus divided. It divided along basically liberal and conservative lines. And if you remember from Church History 102, this is all about the modernists and the fundamentalists and, you know, the big controversies that went on in the late 19th and early 20th century. Basically, two different strategies for dealing with an increasingly hostile modern world. The modernists, the liberals, said we've got to change or die. You know, Spong is not new, right? He's crazy, but he's not new. And of course, the fundamentalists are the ones who are saying, you know, we got to hold the line, we got to resist modernity, kind of thing like this. And American Protestantism, in fact, all American religion was sort of faced with this question of how to deal with modernity in that sense. The modernists or the liberals eventually maintained control of the dominant Protestant structures, the denominations. So the Congregationalists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Northern Baptists, people like that. The modernists, sort of really moderate to modernists, maintain control of the American Protestant structures. And the evangelicals / fundamentalists, and they're not the same. Evangelical and fundamentalist is not the same. But they share theology. They broke away and formed their parallel structures, all the denominations. So the mainline denominations had the National Council of Churches, and the evangelicals had the National Association of Evangelicals. The mainstream had Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Union. The evangelicals had Wheaton and Fuller and Dallas and places like that. Now, mostly this division was on Reformed or Calvinist issues. And again, so American Lutheranism doesn't quite fit into that mold, because they were fighting over issues that were essentially, that were core to the Reformed or the Calvinist Protestants, but not really to the Lutherans. Inerrancy, for example. American Lutherans have from time to time used the doctrine of inerrancy, or the term inerrancy, but even if they use it, they don't necessarily mean the same thing as the evangelicals do or the fundamentalists do when they use the term inerrancy. Lutherans have always had a sort of a slightly different understanding of biblical authority that was more flexible, I think, than the fundamentalists. Lutherans were not particularly easy in either camp. They were not particularly found themselves easily in the mainline Protestant denominations, and they did not. They found affinities, all right, but not particularly a home in that sense. And of course, we were behind the times. We were just especially with the massive immigration in the 19th century. And you got to remember that the immigration was really coming right up until the First World War. And so it takes a long time for American Lutherans to sort of assimilate. As long as you've got immigrants continuing to come over, right? You've got the necessity to maintain separate ministry. Anyways, so and their attempts in the early part of the 20th century to do Lutheranism in English it takes some time to do this. All right. Structurally, we follow the mainline Protestants. We're generally, my rule of thumb is that we're generally about 20 or 30 years behind the rest of mainline Protestantism. So look at the UCC or the Methodists or the Presbyterians today, and you can sort of assume where we're going to be in 20 years. Yikes. But interesting, what happens in the mainline Protestantism has become a form of since the 1930s, of a centralized, corporatized, bureaucratic form of organization and management. And literally what they were doing in the early part of the 20th century, these mainline Protestants, they were paralleling the American corporate business world in terms of their organization. What this means is increasingly centralized national structures for control with consolidated national staffs and headquarters, congregations as franchises of the denomination, an attempt to standardize. I mean, the model is McDonald's. You walk into a McDonald's anywhere in the world and you can get a Big Mac. Now, I mean, there might be some sort of different elements along the way. I remember, you go to Maine, in the summer, you go to the Maine and the McDonald's and you can get lobster rolls. You go to a McDonald's in New Mexico and you can get green chili cheeseburgers. But that's sort of the flavor, The idea is that the congregation would be a franchise of the national organization. Pastors and leaders who pushed the national agenda were rewarded. Right? Okay. And then, of course, the development of standardized procedures and materials. McDonald's, in that sense. We're now at this end of this model. Businesses realized a long time ago that the large mega corporation that made everything from soup to nuts, that was centralized and nationalized, doesn't work very well, and we're realizing that the same thing also doesn't work very well for religion. But now what? That's the real question. So let me talk about Lutheranism now in the 20th century. In 1900, there were probably about 10 to 12 major Lutheran denominations in the United States, mainly ethnically related.